All right, so our session now is on storytelling. We heard from Frank about the importance of getting the information out there and building that connective tissue and that support structure. We have an incredible panel. So our friend Sarah Shanley Hope is going to be our host. She was the founding executive director of the Solutions Project, which was founded by actor Mark Ruffalo and a few other incredible people to do the storytelling and the on-the-ground work of climate justice, of projects on the ground and telling the stories around them. We also have David Gelber, the award-winning producer from 60 Minutes, 3 decades of incredible Emmy award-winning work, who's now pivoted through the Years Project and Years of Living Dangerously and many projects to climate storytelling. And we have Holly Morris, who is the director of Exposure, the film we're going to be showing tonight at 7 o'clock right here. Holly, award-winning filmmaker, Exposure is an incredible story. You'll see a sneak peek of the North Pole, just adventure and cultures and women leadership, just beautiful story. So I'm just honored to have all of them with us, and our friend Eamonn Storr, the recovering ad executive, is joining this because he himself is such a storyteller. So please join me in welcoming our storytelling session to the stage. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Amy, for that nice introduction. And we are Team Story here today, bringing home the last session of panels. I've been asked to kick us off here with sort of set the table, shall we say. I'm Holly Morris. I'm a filmmaker, author, and former book editor. I'm not going to talk so much about my own work, but make a bid for the value and spark of story itself in this urgent moment. Story writ large. Story lies at the heart of every endeavor, every business, every political action represented in this room. But as we've all stumbled out of the sad fog of the pandemic, many of us feel personally, politically, creatively, that what once was isn't, that what once worked doesn't. Life's deck of cards have been tossed into the air. We yearn for a reset. That's why we're here. But first we have to ban the inertia, banish it, the sheer overwhelm, and face the magnitude of our challenges, foremost climate. I hope you're here now in part because you have an inkling, or maybe even a strong belief, that the ancient art of storytelling is an overlooked, incredibly powerful secret weapon in our climate future. Stories are the cartilage of the climate movement. Stories are like oxytocin, you know, that gorgeous hormone that keeps you not hating, even loving your newborn through all manner of postpartum pain and sleep deprivation. Stories shine light on a bridge to the future. I'm a storyteller, and I'm here to tell you our role is no longer to artfully or alarmingly inform. It's not to explain climate change or convert deniers, but to embolden individuals and communities to their own potential, to show a way forward against all odds. Our global challenge has the science, the technology, and even the policy, but we lack the will, the intangible in all this. Will, confidence, agency, and funds are what a diverse next generation needs, especially women of color, in order to take up the mantle and lead. What I'm saying is give storytellers a place at the head table. Let us unleash our power to tell of raw, messy individuals, inspired, of unlikely communities creating possibility, of imagined paths forward into an equitable future. Use us. For better or worse, film and video drive the next generation, not policy or studies. Use film. Invest in storytellers who will embolden your innovative work and our shared goals and urgent climate imperatives. How do I know all this to be true? My polar documentary Exposure, which, as Amy said, you can see her here tonight, 7 o'clock, is the embodiment of these ideas. The film tells the audacious story of regular women from the Arab world and the West who, while hauling 200-pound sledges, pack away their fear and just keep flinging hope 3 meters ahead of them, lunging after it, and in their dangerous, glorious, many would say misguided attempt to ski all the way to the top of the world, the North Pole, which is also climate change ground zero. In the end, I think it's a film that asks you what part you are going to play in a better future and assures you that you can and will play it. Here is a 2-minute trailer from the film.
Any minute now it's going to crack and up underneath you. This is such a dangerous environment.
You could hear the ice breaking. This is the difference between life and death.
My mind wants to keep going, but my body can't keep going.
If anything here moves, we don't stand a chance.
We're going to the North Pole, there's going to be polar bears, it's going to be stupidly cold, there's going to be ice below you, there's no solid ground.
11 women from across Europe and the Arab countries, and we're going to ski the last 100 kilometers to the North Pole.
When we first said that we were going to come and do some polar training in the desert of Oman, a lot of people raised their eyebrows. It gets more bizarre by the minute.
I wanted to put together an expedition that brings together women.
This is it!
This trip is not just for me, it's for all the women out there, for them to reach out for their potential.
2 years, this has changed a lot in my life, this expedition.
It's ordinary women doing something absolutely extraordinary.
So tonight, you'll be able to come to a screening of Holly's film, Exposure. Thank you, Amy, and thank you, Holly, for making the case why storytelling. I'm Sarah Shanley Hope. I'm the Vice President of Narrative Strategies at the Solutions Project. And I'm here to share our story of moving a big, bold idea, which Frank, we did not plan this. Frank teed me up perfectly. Big, bold idea of 100% renewable energy for 100% of the people. We moved that idea from the margins to the mainstream in the time it took the baby in my belly here to become this 7-year-old that you see on the right side. I was the organization's first executive director, and back in 2014 at the New York City Climate March, I carried an incredible and often hard set of lessons learned in authentic storytelling from my time as executive director at what was then the Alliance for Climate Education. Before that, I worked for Van Jones at Green for All and the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, earning an MBA in brand strategy and marketing that had me in corporate brand roles in between. From all that experience, I had a lot of different ways I thought the Solutions Project could, as Mark Brand said yesterday, influence the imagination. And by doing so, change the very conditions within which bold action on climate change was possible. I also learned a ton about storytelling and effective communications from my kids. A now 13-year-old art student who from Harry Potter at the age of 6 has claimed that their favorite genre, this is hard to say out loud, is post-apocalyptic teen lit. And from my youngest, a devout Disney Pixar fan, who both have schooled me about storytelling and world building, being first and foremost about culture, which is actually about how we treat each other and show up in the world that we want to create. With those credentials, I'm going to lead with the punchline, which again, Frank shared. We, and I mean the big we, across a much larger ecosystem of organizations, sectors, and forces, succeeded on 100%. Today, 1 in 3 people in the United States live in a place already committed to 100%. And more states and cities are making this commitment in electricity every single year. 100 cities are already running their grid today with all renewables, and California's grid ran at 100% for at least 24 hours earlier this year. Even though we told a story from the beginning that this reality was inevitable, I can assure you there was zero evidence other than one of our founders' scientific modeling that this was possible when we began. In fact, our founders were literally laughed out of even the greenest of rooms for their vision of 100% back in 2011, 2012, and 2013. I make this joke that there were more white guys named Mark than any other demographic when I began at the Solutions Project. And while the organization's leadership and culture is pivotal, the change that we made is pivotal to our impact, it is not the focus for today's presentation. What is key to the story of 100% is that these three white guys started with a really important element of effective storytelling to create the world that we want: a capacity to collaborate across very different theories of change, business, science, and culture, coming together to do what they could never do alone. And they agreed with my push to add community as the central force for change, and we expanded the vision to include equity with 100% of people. To popularize the idea of 100% for 100%, we focused first on messengers, the humans who tell the stories, above message. This drove us to launch the field's first climate and equity fund, which the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation seeded with a big grant split dollar for dollar between our organization and a fund dedicated to getting resources to grassroots organizations in target states already leading on a clean energy transition. We followed the media work already underway with grant making, and a week before my youngest was born, we launched our third program focused on convening, matchmaking, and otherwise connecting messengers across our movement ecosystem for 100%. This three-part strategy, rooted in grassroots grant making, then sought out to win the narrative that 100% was possible, that it was happening, and that it was just. Focusing on our storytelling for this presentation, we deployed a range of marketing and media tactics that together showed our movement as inclusive, celebratory, and collaborative. Specific culture changes in how you treat people in the world we were building. This was needed to disrupt the dominant and pretty negative public perceptions of the environmental movement as white, doom and gloom, and exclusive. At that New York City Climate March, upper right corner for you all, we matched celebrities with frontline Indigenous leaders so that they were the heroes and our influencers shined their spotlights. We did billboard and other everyday clean energy hero campaigns in cities across the country. Biz Marquee, rest in power, DJ'd an event with New Era Cap Company and our grantees in Buffalo, New York. We inserted grantee stories in documentaries like Jamie Redford's 100% Happening, and brought out the Avengers when our grantees asked for their cultural cachet to follow movement advocacy. And it worked. We mobilized money, media, and momentum behind Indigenous organizers at Standing Rock, who won that pipeline fight until a right-wing narrative strategy won the White House. Environmental justice organizers in California won 100% legislation and passed a bill to direct $1 billion for solar and affordable housing in California. Frontline organizers in New York won 100% legislation that included the strongest climate and equity provisions in the country, ultimately inspiring the Biden-Harris administration's groundbreaking Justice 40 initiative that directs 40% of federal climate and clean energy benefits to frontline communities. This movement-inclusive narrative strategy was key in the success of the broader climate movement, creating a new world. 205 cities committed to 100%, thanks to the Sierra Club and their Ready for 100 campaign. 200 grassroots organizations, mostly women of color led, across 34 states, received more than $10 million just from the Solutions Project, and we inspired more than a dozen new climate and equity funds to launch. And 100% legislation passed in California, Hawaii, Illinois, Maryland, Maine, New Mexico, New York, Nevada, Washington State, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico. Huge success in a groundbreaking and ground-up strategy that was inspired by the grassroots leaders, innovators, and they were in the communities of color most impacted by the climate crisis and pollution. And yet, in 2018 and 19, when we reached this tipping point of success, the underlying power systems of philanthropy and media that we leveraged had not changed. In fact, we even saw backsliding in philanthropy to focus more on white Trump voters despite the success we saw. Not to mention the electoral data that overwhelmingly emphasizes women of color as the winning base. So you can see here, less than 4% of climate philanthropy, this is from a 2019 climate work study, was directed towards equity. Less than 2% were focused on Black and Indigenous and other people of color-led organizations, and less than 1% for women of color-led grassroots organizations in climate. The Solutions Project's own media tracker showed at the same time, 2019, that only 2% of clean energy news references included communities of color in their clean energy reporting, with only 6% using an equity lens. And this is after groundbreaking policy change led by frontline communities of color. So we made 100% commit to justice. Our strategy couldn't just be inclusive and equitable. It had to be accountable and just. We hired a new CEO, Gloria Walton, who was an inaugural grantee partner of the Solutions Project, and who joined our board a few years prior as a thought partner, really pushing our strategy towards this new phase. Under her leadership, Under her leadership, we raised our first round of scaled funding, going from $10 million in grant making over 5 years to now $10 million plus each year in grant making to grassroots, mostly women of color-led organizations. We also influenced major commitments from philanthropy to prioritize climate equity and leadership of color. And now, and this is my newer role, we're building the communications capacity of dozens of grassroots climate justice organizations who have been innovating, winning, and building the future we all want, but haven't had the funding for their multifaceted strategies, let alone for the communication staff that could move the needle on media coverage. So in the last 20 months, the team I now lead has been growing the media capacity and reach of our frontline partners, all while continuing to work with big celebrities, brands, and platforms to amplify their solutions and success. We just launched a new $10 million program with Climate Justice Alliance and Center for Story-Based Strategy to accelerate the capacity building with frontline organizations over the next 2 years. And we are starting to see shifts in the news coverage of communities of color as part of clean energy solutions and equity as a frame in clean energy coverage. We expanded beyond energy and 100% renewables to focus also on food, agriculture, and land use, and water solutions rooted in frontline impacted communities. And in fact, today we released our annual media tracker that shows the racial and gender representation and equity in coverage in all 3 of those sectors for the first time. It's slower, but we're also influencing climate philanthropy and partnering with the established climate communication organizations like the Years Project to understand the incredible gap and a full range of narrative strategies that bring our stories of hope to the mainstream. These stories are not naive, but rooted in the people and places that are surviving not only the climate crisis, but the pandemic, racial violence, voter suppression, you name it. They are the solutionaries, as revolutionary ancestor Grace Lee Boggs defines, and our job is to show up in solidarity so their stories don't just influence our imaginations, but create the future that we want. Thank you so much. So as we shift to, let me slide here. Oh, this is what we're doing next. Sorry about that. As we shift to our panel conversation, I wanted to share a video that the Solutions Project co-produced with TED Countdown that just won a Telly Award that I think is going to frame up the deeper conversation that we're about to have.
There's a story we've been writing together for hundreds of years.
Oil companies compete with each other.
It's about all of us. It takes place right here. It started for many of us as economies were built. But growth rooted in extracting from our planet and our people came at a cost. There were warning signs. Some of us knew what was happening to our communities wasn't right, that it was connected to something bigger, and the impacts were felt by some more than others. People organized and asked questions. Others tried to understand what was happening and sounded the alarm, even as others refused to believe what we told them, that the planet's climate is changing. Our story has heroes big and small. Maybe you even became a hero in your own way. It's a story of hope, persistence, a plan for a better future. There's also despair, denial, and relentless crises. While there are forces that seek to divide or distract us, we choose to act now. This story has many possibilities. Futures that we write first as neighbors and then as a movement. We are coming together, choosing what comes next and refusing to accept defeat. There is hope. Transforming our world to address the climate crisis isn't just urgent and necessary. It is possible, already underway, and leading us to a better future. Countdown is a global initiative to champion and accelerate solutions to the climate crisis, to turn ideas into action. Because in spite of all the challenges, people never stop trying, to shift mindsets and then entire systems.
Investors, they think the future is green.
We have 10 years to change it, so we need to act all together right now.
To change the way we move ourselves and our economy.
Transformation in every global system, from agriculture to retail, shipping to trucking, cement to steel.
And the very foundations upon which we live.
A big detox of transportation is possible.
Electrification will permeate everything.
A phase out of internal combustion engines.
Educating and empowering women and girls is one of the single most important things that we can do to confront carbon pollution.
Everyone must get to a zero carbon future.
When we connect our stories and play an active part, our imaginations are the only limit.
In radical collaboration with each other, we can do this.
And while we're at it, let's make it just and fair for everyone.
No matter what has gone wrong, what can go right?
The solution is to build a new coalition made up of all the groups most affected.
Which story gets in the way of you taking action? Challenge that story.
Our story takes place here. It's been difficult at times and could have unthinkable outcomes. But that was the story we used to tell. Now it's up to us to tell a new one.
So we've had the chance to, hear why storytelling matters. I shared our example at the Solutions Project for how a story can affect change. I hope that little TED promo video showed how business and so many sectors are part of the transformation. Right now, in the next 20 or so minutes, I want to facilitate a conversation going deeper in the characters of the story, the who. And so starting first with you, David, building off your talk from yesterday, tell us a little bit more about why the villain matters in the story and what is wrong that it's absent. Villain stories. How is the villain absent?
I really hope that you guys heard Frank Nepal's presentation earlier this afternoon, because he really acknowledged and made the point that we are losing a war that we cannot afford to lose. So a long time ago, when I was at 60 Minutes, well, not that long ago, but anyway, I learned that if you want to tell a powerful story, it's really good to have a powerful villain. I mean, a really bad guy. So those of us who are telling stories about climate don't have to look very far. As imagine most people here know, there's been tremendous reporting about the behavior of the fossil fuel industry over the last 40 years. Starting in the early 1980s, the big oil companies, they had excellent scientists, and they knew exactly what was going on about climate change. They knew better than the government knew. And those scientists were given the mandate to tell their bosses, to tell the CEOs about what was happening with climate change. This is documented. There have just been two really excellent series that I recommend. One is the PBS series called The Power of Big Oil that was on about 2 weeks ago. Another is a series called Black Gold, which was done by Paramount Plus. And they use a lot of the same characters, and the stories are mind-boggling because these guys, when they knew, what did they do about it, right? I mean, you can't find bigger villains on the planet than the fossil fuel industry. And if you think I'm overstating that, let me tell you that when Jim Hansen told Congress about the detectable greenhouse gas signal and how it's changing climate now in his Senate testimony in 1988, that's when these guys started peeling out the big bucks. I mean, we're talking billions for lobbying, for incredible PR efforts. I mean, it's kind of like Mad Men Meet Climate. You could do a terrific, funny series.
Dark comedy.
If it wasn't so dark about what these guys did. I want to tell you just one. Here's my favorite story about what they did, because you really need to understand this. I mean, and many of you already do, and I know that, but excuse me for that somewhat, I guess, condescending remark. But anyway, so at the time of the Gulf War, Saddam grabs the oil in Kuwait. And man, that really pissed off the oil guys, because that wasn't Saddam's oil, that was their oil. And they were concerned that the American public wasn't motivated sufficiently to go to war to get that oil back. So what they did was they put together $12 million and they gave it to Hill and Knowlton. And they said, find us a message that will convince the American public that we need to go to war with Saddam.
Why don't you tell us who that is?
The what?
Who's Hill and Knowlton? Tell folks who that is. Lawyers, right?
The Hill and Knowlton. It's a PR firm.
PR.
Yeah, I'm just saying. I don't know if everybody.
Yeah. Oh,
understands
Hill
that.
and
Sorry.
Knowlton. I speak too fast. Anyway, a very powerful PR firm, and so they did a lot of A/B tests where they measure one message against another, and they came up with the conclusion that the winning message was Saddam commits Nazi-like atrocities. 2 weeks after that, a 15-year-old girl who just happened to be the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to Washington got up and gave a tearful press conference to a bunch of congressmen in D.C. And she told about how she personally had witnessed Saddam's soldiers in ICU rooms in the Kuwait City Hospital, taking premature babies out of incubators, leaving them on the floor to die, and then stealing the incubators back to Iraq. That became one of George H.W. Bush's arguments for why we needed to go to war with Saddam. Now, here's the thing. Not one scintilla of that story was true. It was all made up, all a lie, and there's a CBC documentary about it. I'm going to bet that almost nobody in this crowd knows that they did that sort of thing. But that wasn't all they did. They had years of... You couldn't find a juicier villain than Lee Raymond, the guy who was the president of Exxon, whose scientists told him the truth about what was going on, and who said time after time, we just don't know enough about this. Why take drastic actions when we just simply have no idea whether oil is causing climate change? Now, of course, the North Star for the industry, and it continues to this day, is to keep the government off their backs. No laws that tell the oil companies how much greenhouse gases they can emit. There was really a very heroic attempt by a lot of people, among Al Gore, among others, to pass a treaty in Kyoto. Well, the treaty was passed, but the U.S. didn't sign it. That would have actually established mandatory limits. Stopping those mandatory limits was the goal, and has been the goal, of the fossil fuel industry since the 1980s, and continues today. I mean, Darren Woods, the current president of ExxonMobil, doesn't think that it's necessary to put emissions standards, to government impose limits. That's socialism.
And instead, it's about individual action.
It's about individual action. It's about you, Sarah Shanley Hope, not using a plastic straw. It's on you and you and you. You know, and that, by the way, is an orchestrated strategy for that the industry is using. Now, I'm going on too much, and I'll stop. But let me just say one more thing about this. This is not only about the stories that we tell the public, because people, as Frank was saying, people are not angry enough right now. They're just not. So that when gas prices go up, people don't care that much about climate. We've got to make people angrier. But to do that, we've got to not only think about the stories we tell the public, we have to think about what we tell ourselves, the stories we tell ourselves about the stories that we tell the public. Because we are engaged in a war, and it is no less apocalyptic a war than the two wars of the 20th century. And it's not enough that, you know, just make sure that your NGO or your startup or your piece of the action survives and flourishes. That's not what this meeting should be about. We got to work together and have a movement that gets people really bleeping angry and willing to take money out of banks, to make it to get out of the street, to do everything that needs to be done to create a real movement, which we do not yet have, by the way. We don't. We have lots of groups that are doing lots of different things. We do not have an ecumenical movement. All right, I've talked enough.
And we have different perspectives on this panel about the story and the emotions and the range of emotions. But what we do agree on is who controls the narrative controls the future. So I'm wondering, Holly, if you want to speak a little bit to what you've seen in the documentary film space, where you can actually craft a narrative and what's possible.
Yeah, so, well, for my part, in trying to tell stories is really to, well, I'm all about having estro-charged documentaries, right? So the
I love that, estro-charged, like estrogen charged.
Yeah. Tell where I am in my life right now. So the last film I did, before this expedition film, was called The Babushkas of Chernobyl. And this is a story about Chernobyl that you haven't seen before, necessarily, and in large part because the narrators of the story are old Ukrainian women speaking Ukrainian, and they have the power, and they have the authenticity, and they have the humor and everything else to carry that story. And so I feel it's really important to give them that stage forevermore and preserve their story and energize and complicate the story around Chernobyl by them being the narrators.
And choosing who the characters were then. So I'm curious, from Babushkas of Chernobyl, what were those archetypes that you saw come across in that narrative?
Well, I mean, one of the main characters of the film was a woman named Hannah Zavartinya, and she is someone who survived Stalin, survived Hitler, survived Chernobyl, refused to be evacuated, snuck back home and to live in a contaminated exclusion zone after the accident, and just this spring was dealing with Russians and was again forcibly evacuated and again insisted on going home. And she's 89, something like that. So
that gave me chills.
She's my archetype.
Yeah, and so when you think about the existential crisis of climate, and you think of millions of people who have actually survived what many of us can't even imagine, there is this grit, there is this power in them telling their own stories. And so that I wanted to bring, Eamonn, you into the conversation. If you can speak a little bit to the experience with the last New York City mayor's race and how you flipped the script of the typical, get out the vote campaign.
Yeah.
Who are the characters in your story?
Yeah, I mean, I'm here in a STEAM company. I don't consider myself a master storyteller, and I'm in all of the work that you do. My background is I actually came from people like Hill and Knowlton. I was a WPP guy. So I spent 20 years in that business, and I spent 20 years making bad ads, mainly, from people who wish they were him but failed, or Holly that failed, and end up making ads in agencies. And they still are overpaid and they still think they are master storytellers, but they're not. They're making things for stuff like selling 0.01% more toothpaste in India. That was one of my jobs. And I lost my soul. That's why I described. We did, actually. They were quite good at it. But there was selling products that people didn't need. Indians actually don't need toothpaste. It grows naturally on the trees. The nature is around them, and their teeth are healthy without Colgate. Although Colgate's a good company, to be fair. So my journey, and I'll get to the mayor briefly, is I couldn't live in that world anymore. I had children, and I couldn't understand. I had an imbalance in my life, and I went to the Guardian, and then I found myself surrounded from poacher to gamekeeper, which is why I talk about being a recovering ad exec. I was surrounded by journalists who are brilliant storytellers, maybe some of the best in their craft, and they're paid next to nothing, most of them, and they tell amazing stories, and they can stand up in front of presidents and hold their own and hold them to account. And we made stories like 6 by 9, which is one of the first VR documentaries to help people understand what it feels like to be in solitary confinement. And we took that to the White House, and you put your goggles on, and you spend about 10 minutes just in the space of what it feels like to be in a solitary confinement cell. And grown, very senior politicians, captains of industry, CMOs of GE would put those goggles on and they'd cry afterwards. They couldn't even have a conversation. But it didn't change what they did. Right? It didn't change the behavior. They still spent the money the same way. And so what Fairshare really does, my business, is we try and help, based on the learning of The Guardian and the learning of WPP, that we understand that businesses have to make money, and we try and get a better balance of purpose and profit, on the belief that if you tell authentic marketing stories that are true to the values and the company you are, they will travel on their own merit. We did that for healthcare heroes. It was called for JetBlue during COVID. It was right, we need to do something during COVID, we need to give back. Well, go and talk to your cabin crew. Ask them what they want to do, right? Ask them what they care about. Turns out 38% of JetBlue employees are either first responders or have them in their families. They wanted to give back to their own, which is where we did Healthcare Heroes, and it became the most successful campaign JetBlue have ever done in 25 years. It cost us $60,000 and $0 in media, and it reached nearly 1 billion people. So I'm at the other end of your world. I'm at the end of just trying to get marketeers to do less bad things, less Pepsi ads. Somehow in a corporation, someone had a great idea that a board bought into, that a can of Pepsi could turn a riot around. Do you remember that? How delusional is that? To think that we're that stupid as our kids are. The piece we're going to show, I think, is a really simple thing. So what we focus on in Fairshare, in the storytelling part, is do authentic marketing, and then let's build stories around it that stand behind your values and your mission and what you do. But the messenger is what counts. We'll work out the message, but who are we trying to reach? And in this case, the brief came directly from the mayor's office, because there's something like 20 agencies that work for the mayor's office in New York. Everyone does pretty much bad PSAs. They're pretty hard to watch. They're pretty boring. They're cheap because they work on low margins. They came to us because they were trying to communicate a really complicated message. Ranked choice voting has never been done in a city the size of New York. The client of the mayor's office couldn't articulate to us what it is, because it's complicated. It's not simple to explain. All we did with that, we're not the master storytellers. What we understand is if you want more diverse people in New York City to vote than have ever voted before, let's go and ask them how they would talk to each other. And so that's what we did. We put this together at 2 weeks' notice, very little budget, with a crew that was entirely of BIPOC background, and we went out to the community and we shot it. It took us like a few days, and it rocked.
Let's see if
it works.
Oh, shoot.
the big cell.
Yeah, exactly. Did it work? Here we go.
Promising.
One more click. No. Okay, great. So they'll tee it up here in a second. What I loved, that we're really going to oversell it because I'm going to talk about the clip before we show it. But what I loved seeing this example is, there's a similar approach that we took at the Solutions Project. Up until that point, a lot of environmental NGOs would ask celebrities to be in front of the camera to give environmental messages, and we said no. That's actually it's the everyday clean energy hero. It's the frontline leader who, the celebrities actually prefer to shine their spotlight on them, and they're the better messengers for the stories. And so that's what you really did with this PSA. It's not candidate, it's not the mayor talking, it's voters as the heroes in the story.
And we did say when we did it, it's not going to be a PSA, it's your un-PSA.
Yeah.
And in the end, it was, de Blasio had a lot rise on it, it was his legacy, but he actually went on TV and introduced it himself because he was so happy with it. But while we're waiting, I'll explain a very quick project we're working on now, which is we're doing a project for a pharmaceutical company, not a company that's typically comfortable putting their brand in the hands of others, right? But they had a brief, again, we're not their rostered agency, we don't pitch, but they understood that there's a dramatic increase in cardiac illness in this country. It's 40% increase in low income, people of color who are double on $40,000 a year rural communities. And they are literally working themselves to death. They're shift working and they're female bias. They have bad diet, they don't have access to, they have bad exercise, they don't have access to decent healthcare. And they, again, had a situation of a group of agencies that had months to crack a brief that didn't. And they asked us to come in and we did a pitch. We went and spoke to the youth, we went and spoke to the communities, because our belief was that these people don't listen to government. That's why most of them, or a higher proportion of them, aren't vaccinated. They don't listen to institutions, they don't listen to healthcare. They don't really even listen to themselves, their own bodies. The one people they listen to is their kids, right? They listen to their children, they work to death to get their kids a better opportunity than they had. And we went and spoke to the kids. We did it with Civics Unplugged and we did it with Gentlemen's Retreat. And we spoke to those children. Gosh, we're sorry, we're running over. But we spoke to those children and we said, we pitched them the idea, and is this going to run?
Finish your, yes, it will. Do you want to finish your
I'll
sentence?
finish it quickly. But when we went back to the client and we said, if you're really genuine about what you want to do, you will put the brand, you'll put your mission in the hands of the children and let them tell you what stories they want to tell to their parents to change institutional behavior. And incredibly in 6 multinational agencies, we got the business, which we're now working on. They said, you were the only company that spoke to the community. And I was like, is that the most insane thing you could hear? Like 6 other companies didn't even bother to speak to low-income, rural black people. Instead, they worked up ideas about doing food trucks and mobile health centers in boardrooms of New York. It's like, go to the people you're trying to get to. I'll shut up now.
Okay,
Let it speak for itself.
It's been quite a year, New Yorkers, but we are still standing. And on June 22nd, we'll have the power to vote for the leadership we want for our city. Rank your top 5 candidates in order of preference. The more you rank, the louder your voice. If your first choice doesn't win, then your second, third, fourth, and fifth choice will be counted until there is a winner, giving you more say than ever before, but only if you rank your vote.
Ranked choice voting, it gives minorities a voice.
Vote for the change that you want in your neighborhood.
I'm voting to promote arts in New York City.
I'd like to see us smaller businesses, mom and pop shops.
So if you want change, you need to vote.
Suggest, beg, plead, please go out and vote.
Let's lift the voices of local community.
It's our time, New York.
New York, don't waste your vote.
Democracy just got an upgrade with ranked choice voting. Don't waste your vote. Rank it. Make a plan to vote this June. For more information, go to voting.nyc.
Lived up to the hype.
Just about.
So in our final minute, yeah, a few words. Just kind of wrap it. What would you like, or a URL, something?
I would just bounce off of this. You know, optimism, hope, humor. All these things need to be a part of our stories, even though we're dealing with this deathly crisis.
I asked you guys a question earlier over coffee. If you had, if there was a green mogul in the audience who said, okay, you can have, here's a blank check. You can have $100 million to spend any way you want to mobilize the public on climate. How would you spend the money? And you're not going to, in 30 seconds, you're not going to answer that question, but I think it's worth thinking about for everybody to think about how you would, because we have those kind of green moguls in this country right now, and they're not doing what they should, by the way. Some of them are doing okay, but they're not putting together a huge ecumenical movement. And the question is, how do you most effectively, from a communications point of view, spend that money so Americans will get pissed off enough to do something about climate?
Yeah, scale resources for
next year we'll
frontline
come back and answer that question.
That's what I would say. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.